Exactly. By imitating those distortions, we could take the shroud image and put it back into that shape and figure out what the face looked like. It gave us a blueprint.
You can see the figure looks more human.
Yeah, looking really good.
Do you think it would be up to you to profile?
Yeah, it's going to be very helpful for me, because what I can do is I can actually take this information and start building a real three-dimensional head. Just through information that you pulled right from the shroud. And then we can put a back head on there, and then we can go from there and make a really good 3D face.
The shroud is a negative, but the clue is that you have to talk in terms of a three-dimensional negative. And there is such a thing. It's called a mold. A 3D negative is a mold. It's a container. You fill it, you have a three-dimensional thing formed from it. And that's what the Shroud of Turin is an instruction set for. It encodes a three-dimensional mold.
But after the devastating results of the carbon-14 tests, which said the shroud was only 700 years old, can the image in the cloth really claim to be the face of Jesus? Though some scientific researchers have pronounced the shroud a fake because of the controversial carbon-14 tests, the mystery lingers on. Historical researchers have found evidence in some of history's darkest corners, suggesting that the shroud existed long before its first known appearance in 14th century France.
The biggest problem with shroud history is that there are huge gaps in it. If we have a verifiable history of the shroud, it really only goes back to about 1350. But we have all these other clues earlier in the historic record.
Many historians believe the shroud was in Constantinople until the city was destroyed in the year 1204. But no one could account for its whereabouts until it showed up in France a century and a half later. Until now.
We have now additional testimony from France that suggests that the cloth was well known.
New evidence suggests that a secretive band of holy crusaders, known as the Knights Templar, may have had possession of the shroud, or at the very least, were aware of its existence in the year 1287.
Over the years, the real serious shroud historians have always associated the shroud to, at some point in its history, to the Knights Templar.
Just in this last year, a Vatican researcher unearthed a document, the memoir of a man who was a member of the Knights Templar. And in this document, he said that as part of his training as one of the Knights Templar, he was made to kiss a long linen cloth on which was imprinted the image of a man. And this shroud that appears in this document, it is proposed by the Vatican researchers, is the very shroud that left Constantinople and disappeared for the period of 150 years before it reappeared in France.
It doesn't mean necessarily they had possession of it. It does mean that they probably knew about it.
Additional historic evidence seems to date the shroud back even further in time, at least to the late 1100s.
Probably one of the most significant documents to be unearthed in the past 30 years or so with regard to the history of the shroud is the Hungarian Prey manuscript.
Two of the illustrations are very significant. One of them shows the burial preparations. You see Jesus lying on a burial shroud. You actually see Jesus lying on this cloth. Now what's interesting about it is that the way the body is laid out is very similar to what we see on the shroud. But what is more fascinating is the second picture, which is the empty tomb. Or to be more precise, the empty shroud.
Very clearly, it is showing the zigzag lines of the herringbone pattern weave of the shroud. The shroud has a very distinctive weave.
Most importantly, it illustrated a set of L-shaped burn holes that are on the shroud and predate the fire of 1532 that did all the damage down both sides of the shroud. So if you look at the shroud prior to 1352, what you would see first, before you saw anything else, were these L-shaped burnholes which had dark char around each hole.
To me, I call this a DNA match. There's no question that what is depicted on the Hungarian prayer manuscript is exactly what we know today as the Shroud of Turin.
So we know that whoever illuminated the Hungarian prayer manuscript had seen what we call the Shroud of Turin at some point before he created that manuscript in 1191.
And that is much earlier than the first possible date assigned by this carbon-14 dating.
Dig deeper in time, and historians pick up a trail of a small, blood-stained cloth called the Sudarium of Oviedo, known to exist as far back as the 7th century.
In the Gospel accounts of the Passion of Jesus, there were two cloths. One was the burial shroud, which is the one that we know as the shroud, the large cloth. But the other was the smaller face cloth, as it was called.
Sudarium of Oviedo is believed to be the cloth that wrapped Jesus' face when he was on the cross. As soon as he passed away, it would have been a tradition to cover the face of the deceased.
Even in modern days, if there's an accident and somebody dies and the victim's laying there, what do? We cover his face.
It's about the size of a small bath towel. It is in Oviedo, Spain, and has been there ever since the early 7th century, 616. Now, this Sudarium of Oviedo is nothing like the shroud. If you were to look at it, it looked like there's just a mess.
The Sudarium seems to be a much bloodier cloth, and indeed it is. If it was used first, it would have absorbed much of the blood.
But put them together, and the blood on the Sudarium lines up with the face on the shroud,
which suggests that both cloths covered the same face at approximately the same time.
And we know the Sudarium has a documented history to the early 7th century. If these two cloths are correlated, then obviously the shroud must have a date far earlier than the medieval date as suggested by the carbon dating labs.
Another thing the two cloths appear to have in common is traces of pollen that have been found in their fibers. Traces that may offer a clue about where the cloths originally came from.
There is much unique pollen that is unique to Israel. In fact, there is one plant called Gundalia tourniforti, and this particular plant is a flowering thorn plant, and it grows within a 50-mile radius of Jerusalem. From a point of science, the Shroud of Turin can never be proven absolutely to be the Shroud of Jesus. It can't. But there's a different view of evidence, and that is the courtroom definition of evidence. If, for instance, the shroud was on trial as to whether it's authentic or not, I believe the jury would say it's authentic.
Now one man is taking this search for answers one step further, attempting to bring the witness himself to the stand.